The radio crackled to life at 0347 hours in the command bunker beneath Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood motionless as the voice of General Kabanda filled the concrete chamber with an order that would change everything. Operation Desert Wind is a go. All units proceed to Sector 7 immediately. No exceptions. Traoré's hand hovered over the radio transmitter. Around him, his most trusted lieutenants waited for his response. The order was clear, direct, and came from the highest levels of military command. But something felt wrong. Something felt like a trap. For months, Traoré had been building his own network within the military ranks. Young officers who shared his vision of a Burkina Faso free from foreign interference. Soldiers who believed their country's resources should benefit their own people, not distant capitals in Paris or Washington. The movement had grown quietly, carefully, always staying beneath the radar of the old guard generals who still controlled the military hierarchy. But that was only the beginning of a much larger game being played in the shadows. 3 weeks earlier, Traoré had intercepted communications between General Kabanda and unknown foreign contacts. The conversations were coded, but the meaning was clear enough. Plans were being made. Movements of troops were being discussed. And Traoré's name had come up more than once. Now, as he stared at the radio, he realized this moment had been inevitable. The order to move all his units to Sector 7 would leave the capital defenseless. It would scatter his most loyal men across the countryside, far from the centers of power. It was exactly the kind of order you would give if you wanted to neutralize a potential threat without firing a single shot. Lieutenant Sankara stepped forward. "Captain, the men are ready to move. What are your orders?" Traoré looked around the bunker at the faces of the officers who had pledged their loyalty to him. These were not politicians or career climbers. These were soldiers who had bled for their country in the endless war against insurgents in the north. They had watched their brothers die while foreign advisors counted mineral exports and calculated profit margins. "We hold position," Traoré said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water. Around the bunker, officers exchanged glances. Disobeying a direct order from high command was tantamount to mutiny. In the military hierarchy of Burkina Faso, such defiance could mean court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. But Sankara nodded slowly. "What do you need us to do?" No one expected what came next. Instead of explaining his reasoning or trying to justify the decision, Traoré simply walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the bunker. Inside were documents he had been collecting for months. Financial records, communication intercepts, photographs of meetings that were supposed to be secret. He spread the papers across the central table. "Look at these." The evidence was damning. Bank transfers from shell companies registered in Luxembourg to accounts controlled by senior military officers. Meetings between General Kabanda and representatives of mining corporations. Most damaging of all, a recorded conversation in which Kabanda discussed the need to eliminate what he called radical elements within the junior officer corps. Lieutenant Konaté picked up one of the financial documents. "This shows General Yameoga received €2 million last month." "From a company that doesn't exist," Traoré replied. "Registered to an address that turns out to be a parking lot in Zurich." The pattern was clear. The senior leadership of the military had been compromised. They were taking orders not from the government of Burkina Faso, but from foreign interests who wanted to maintain control over the country's gold mines and strategic position in the Sahel region. But that was only the beginning of what Traoré had discovered. 2 months earlier, a French intelligence operative named Marcel Dubois had been captured by Traoré's men during a routine patrol near the border with Mali. Instead of turning him over to command as protocol required, Traoré had made a different choice. He had interrogated Dubois personally, in a safe house away from prying eyes. What Dubois revealed under pressure had changed everything Traoré thought he knew about the war his country was fighting. The insurgent groups that had been terrorizing the population were not just random extremists. They were being armed and funded by the same foreign networks that were paying off the generals. The chaos served a purpose. It justified the presence of foreign military bases. It created instability that kept commodity prices low and extraction operations profitable. The radio crackled again. General Kabanda's voice was more insistent this time. "Captain Traoré, acknowledge your orders immediately." Traoré picked up the transmitter. Around him, his officers held their breath. This was the moment of no return. Once he spoke, there would be no going back to the old ways of following orders without question. "General Kabanda," Traoré said clearly, "my units will remain in position to defend the capital." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then Kabanda's voice returned, colder now, stripped of any pretense of military courtesy. "Captain, you are relieved of command effective immediately. Report to headquarters for disciplinary action." Traoré set down the transmitter and looked at his men. "Gentlemen, we are now officially in rebellion against the military command of Burkina Faso." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Lieutenant Sankara stepped forward and removed his insignia of rank, the symbols that connected him to the chain of command that had just branded them all as traitors. "Then we follow Captain Traoré," he said simply. One by one, the other officers did the same. The small pile of insignia on the table represented more than military rank. It represented the end of one phase of their lives and the beginning of something entirely different. But that was only the beginning of the night that would change Burkina Faso forever. Within hours, word of Traoré's defiance had spread through the military communications network. Some units remained loyal to the high command. Others began to question orders they had never questioned before. By dawn, the country's armed forces were effectively split between those who supported the old system and those who believed change was necessary. The first confrontation came at the airbase outside Ouagadougou. Colonel Zerbo, commander of the Air Force units stationed there, had received orders to prepare for immediate deployment to Sector 7. But half of his pilots were young officers who had been quietly recruited into Traoré's network over the previous months. When Zerbo gave the order to scramble, nothing happened. The pilots sat in their ready room, looking at each other with the sudden realization that they faced the same choice Traoré had faced hours earlier. Follow orders that felt wrong, or take a stand for what they believed was right. Major Compaoré, the senior pilot, stood up slowly. "Colonel, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was tense but civil. Zerbo was not corrupt like some of the generals. He was simply a career officer who had always believed in following the chain of command. But as Compaoré explained what they had learned about the foreign funding and the manipulation of the insurgency, doubt began to creep into his voice. "These are serious accusations," Zerbo said finally. "Do you have proof?" Compaoré handed him a tablet computer. On the screen were photographs of General Kabanda meeting with Marcel Dubois, the French operative, 3 weeks before Dubois was captured. The timestamp showed the meeting had taken place at a luxury hotel in Abidjan, far from any official military business. "How did you get this?" Zerbo asked. Captain Traoré has been building a case for months. We're not acting on emotion or impulse. We have evidence. But that was only the beginning of the revelations that would emerge over the next few hours. As word of the military split reached the presidential palace, President Traoré faced his own impossible choice. The constitution gave him authority over the military, but constitutions meant little when the men with guns were divided among themselves. He could try to mediate between the factions, or he could choose a side and hope he was backing the winner. His chief of staff, a careful man named Ouedraogo, brought him the first reports shortly after sunrise. Mr. President, we have a situation. Captain Traoré has refused orders from General Kabanda and declared his units will defend the capital against what he calls foreign manipulation of our military command. Traoré rubbed his temples. He had been president for 6 years, but nothing in his political experience had prepared him for this kind of crisis. What does Traoré want? That's not entirely clear, sir. But his supporters are calling for a complete review of all foreign military agreements and an investigation into the funding sources of senior officers. The president walked to his office window, looking out over a city that appeared calm but was actually balanced on the edge of chaos. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the direction of the main military base. Whether it was from training exercises or something more serious, he could not tell. "Get me a direct line to Captain Traoré," he said finally. The call came through 20 minutes later. Traoré's voice was respectful but firm. "Mr. President. Captain, I need to understand what you think you're accomplishing. The military cannot function if officers simply refuse orders they disagree with. Mr. President, with respect, the military cannot function when its senior leadership is taking orders from foreign governments and corporations. We swore an oath to defend Burkina Faso, not to serve the interests of mining companies and intelligence agencies." Traoré had heard rumors about foreign influence in the military, but he had assumed they were exaggerated. "What evidence do you have?" "I can have documentation delivered to your office within the hour. Bank records, communications intercepts, photographs of meetings that never appeared on any official calendar. The evidence is extensive." But that was only the beginning of a conversation that would reshape the country's political landscape. While Traoré spoke with the president, his intelligence network was uncovering even more disturbing information. Lieutenant Konaté had been monitoring communications from the French military base that officially provided advisory support to Burkina Faso's counter-terrorism operations. The intercepts revealed that French commanders had been coordinating directly with General Kabanda to ensure that certain areas remained unstable. Mining regions where new deposits had been discovered were deliberately left underprotected, allowing insurgent groups to maintain control. This kept the areas too dangerous for Chinese or Russian companies to operate, preserving French corporate interests in the resource extraction. "Captain," Konaté reported, "they're not just stealing money. They're actively sabotaging our national security to protect their business interests." The implications were staggering. Traoré had suspected corruption, but the reality was far worse than simple greed. The foreign networks had turned Burkina Faso's own military into a tool for maintaining colonial economic relationships that were supposed to have ended decades earlier. As news of the evidence spread through Traoré's network, the rebellion began to take on a different character. This was not just a military coup motivated by personal ambition. This was a fight for genuine independence from foreign control that had never really ended. But General Kabanda was not going to surrender without a fight. No one expected what came next. Instead of trying to negotiate or waiting for political mediation, Kabanda made a decision that revealed just how desperate the situation had become. He activated what intelligence services call a dead man's switch, a pre-arranged signal to foreign allies that local assets were compromised and immediate intervention was necessary. The signal went out at 1400 hours on a secure satellite communication channel. Within minutes, response teams in France, the United States, and several African countries allied with Western interests began preparing for rapid deployment to Burkina Faso. The official justification would be humanitarian intervention to prevent civil war. The real purpose was to ensure that Traoré's rebellion did not succeed in exposing the full extent of foreign manipulation of West African governments. But Traoré had anticipated this possibility. His months of intelligence gathering had revealed not just the corruption within his own military, but the broader network of foreign bases, corporate interests, and political arrangements that kept countries like Burkina Faso in a state of controlled dependency. He knew that if his rebellion appeared to be succeeding, intervention would be inevitable. So he had prepared accordingly. Lieutenant Sankara entered the command bunker with a secure communication device. "Captain, we have confirmation. The package has been delivered." The package was a complete copy of all the evidence Traoré had collected, along with detailed analysis and supporting documentation. But it had not been delivered to local media or government officials who could be pressured or silenced. Instead, it had been transmitted simultaneously to news organizations, human rights groups, and anti-corruption investigators in 37 different countries. Within hours, the story would be public knowledge across Africa and beyond. The foreign networks that had operated in secrecy for decades would be exposed to scrutiny they could not control or contain. "How long before the first stories are published?" Traoré asked. "Estimated 6 hours for the first online reports. Traditional media will follow within 12 to 18 hours. Traoré nodded. The timing was crucial. Once the evidence became public, it would be much harder for foreign governments to justify military intervention as humanitarian assistance. The world would know that the crisis in Burkina Faso was not about preventing civil war, but about preserving a system of economic exploitation. But that was only the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the entire operation. General Kabanda, realizing that his foreign allies might not arrive in time to save his position, made a final desperate move. He ordered units still loyal to his command to surround the capital and prepare for what he called the restoration of military discipline. The order effectively declared war on Traoré's forces, but it also revealed something important about the balance of power. Kabanda could not simply arrest Traoré and his supporters through normal military channels. Too many units had declared for the rebellion. The only way to restore the old system was through violence. As armored vehicles moved through the streets of Ouagadougou, civilians began to understand that their country was balanced on the edge of civil war. But instead of hiding in their homes, something unexpected happened. Thousands of people took to the streets in support of Traoré's rebellion. The crowds were not organized by any political party or activist group. They were ordinary citizens who had grown tired of watching their country's wealth disappear while they struggled with poverty and insecurity. The revelation that foreign corporations and corrupt generals had been deliberately maintaining chaos for profit had touched something deep in the national consciousness. President Kabore, watching the demonstrations from his office, realized that the crisis had evolved beyond a simple military dispute. This had become a popular uprising against foreign control of Burkina Faso's destiny. He picked up the secure phone that connected him directly to Traoré's command bunker. "Captain, I need to meet with you immediately." "Mr. President, that might not be safe. General Kabanda's forces are moving against us." "Then I'll come to you." But that was only the beginning of the most crucial conversation in Burkina Faso's modern history. The meeting took place in the presidential limousine, parked in a secure location between the palace and Traoré's stronghold. Both men were accompanied by minimal security, a gesture of mutual trust that surprised observers on both sides. Traoré spoke first. "Captain, I've reviewed the evidence your people provided. If even half of it is accurate, we're dealing with a level of foreign interference that threatens our sovereignty as a nation." "Mr. President, every document has been verified through multiple sources. This is not speculation or conspiracy theory. This is systematic subversion of our government and military by foreign interests." The president was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would determine everything that followed. "What do you need from me to end this crisis without destroying the country?" Traoré had prepared for this moment, but he still felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His answer would determine whether Burkina Faso moved toward genuine independence or descended into the kind of chaos that had consumed other African nations. "Mr. President, we need three things. First, immediate suspension of all foreign military agreements pending a complete review. Second, freezing of all assets connected to the corruption network while investigations proceed. Third, formation of a transitional government that includes representatives from the military reform movement. And General Kabanda. He will face trial for treason, along with anyone else who sold our national interests to foreign powers." But that was only the beginning of the negotiation that would reshape Burkina Faso's future. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with both men working through the practical details of transferring power while avoiding civil war. They were interrupted twice by urgent communications, once when General Kabanda's forces reached the outskirts of the capital, and again when the first international news reports about the corruption evidence began appearing online. The second interruption changed everything. Once the story became public, the dynamics of the crisis shifted dramatically. Foreign governments that had been preparing to intervene suddenly found themselves defending their actions in the court of international public opinion. The French Foreign Ministry issued a statement denying any improper influence in Burkina Faso's internal affairs, but the denials rang hollow when evidence of meetings and financial transfers was freely available online. Similarly, mining corporations that had been operating through corrupt arrangements found their stock prices falling as investors realized the legal and reputational risks. President Traoré received a call from the French ambassador just as his meeting with Traoré was concluding. The conversation was tense and brief. "Mr. President, Paris is concerned about the instability in your country. We are prepared to provide immediate assistance to restore order." "Thank you for your concern," Traoré replied carefully, "but Burkina Faso will handle this situation through our own constitutional processes." The ambassador's tone became more insistent. "Mr. President, we have significant investments to protect. The current situation is unacceptable. I understand your position, but our sovereignty is not negotiable." When Traoré ended the call, Traoré was watching him carefully. "Mr. President, that was essentially a threat." "I know. Which is why we need to move quickly to present a united front." But that was only the beginning of the international pressure that would test their resolve over the coming days. By evening, the situation had stabilized enough for Traoré and Traoré to appear together on national television. The joint address was carefully crafted to present their arrangement as a constitutional transition rather than a military coup. Citizens of Burkina Faso, the president began, today we have uncovered evidence of serious corruption and foreign interference in our national institutions. In response, I am announcing the formation of a transitional government dedicated to cleaning up these problems and restoring full sovereignty to our nation. Traoré spoke next, wearing his military uniform but addressing the camera as a citizen rather than a soldier. We did not seek this confrontation, but we could not stand by while our country was sold to the highest bidder. The evidence of corruption will be made available to all citizens, and those responsible will face justice. The broadcast was watched by millions across Burkina Faso and throughout West Africa. More importantly, it was monitored closely by foreign governments and corporate interests that had assumed they could manage the crisis through traditional diplomatic and economic pressure. But the combination of public evidence, popular support, and unified political military leadership created a situation they had not anticipated. For the first time in decades, a West African nation was asserting genuine independence from the networks of influence that had shaped the region since the colonial era. General Kabanda, watching the broadcast from his own command center, realized that his position had become untenable. His foreign allies were now focused on damage control rather than supporting his restoration to power. The evidence against him was public knowledge, making him a liability rather than an asset. He made one final call to his French contact, a man who had promised support that had never materialized. "The situation has changed," the voice said coldly. "We cannot provide the assistance we discussed. But you promised." "We promised nothing. Good luck, General." The line went dead, leaving Kabanda to face the reality that he had been abandoned by the same foreign interests he had served so faithfully. But that was only the beginning of the reckoning that would follow. Over the next 72 hours, a remarkable transformation took place across Burkina Faso. Military units that had been divided between competing loyalties began to unite behind the transitional government. Citizens who had lived with corruption and foreign interference for so long they had accepted it as normal began to believe that change was actually possible. Most importantly, the evidence of foreign manipulation began to inspire similar investigations in neighboring countries. Mali, Niger, and Chad all announced reviews of their own military and economic agreements with foreign powers. The revelation that foreign corporations and governments had been deliberately maintaining instability across the Sahel region for economic benefit had created what intelligence analysts called a cascade effect. Each new investigation uncovered additional evidence of manipulation, creating a regional movement toward genuine independence that no single foreign power could contain. Traoré, promoted to colonel by the transitional government, found himself at the center of something much larger than the military rebellion he had started. He was now a symbol of African resistance to neo-colonial control, a role he had never sought but could not abandon. In a secure briefing room, he met with intelligence officers from across West Africa who had come to share information about foreign interference in their own countries. "Colonel," said Major Keita from Mali, "what you uncovered here is just the beginning. The same patterns exist everywhere. The same companies, the same bank accounts, the same strategies for maintaining control." "What do you need from us?" Traoré asked. "Coordination. If we act together, they cannot isolate and destroy us one by one. If we act separately, we will be picked off like we always have been." But that was only the beginning of a conversation that would reshape the entire Sahel region. The meeting lasted 6 hours and produced what would later be called the Ouagadougou Accords, a secret agreement between military reform movements across West Africa to share intelligence, coordinate investigations, and provide mutual support against foreign interference. The accords were not a formal treaty that could be signed by governments or ratified by parliaments. They were a practical arrangement between serving officers who had taken similar risks and faced similar pressures. But in many ways, they represented the most significant step toward genuine African unity since the independence movements of the 1960s. 3 months later, the full impact of Traoré's decision to disobey orders had become clear. Corruption networks that had operated across West Africa for decades had been exposed and dismantled. Foreign military bases that had served corporate interests rather than security needs were being closed or restructured. Mining agreements that had channeled wealth away from African nations were being renegotiated on more equitable terms. The changes were not without cost. Economic pressure from foreign governments and corporations created immediate hardships. Some countries faced sanctions designed to punish their assertion of independence. But the popular support generated by the corruption revelations sustained political leaders through the difficult transition period. Traoré himself had become something he never intended to be, a continental hero whose image appeared on murals from Dakar to Nairobi. But he remained focused on the practical work of building institutions that could resist future foreign manipulation. In his final report to the transitional government, he wrote, "We have learned that independence is not something you achieve once and then forget about. It is something you must defend every day against those who profit from your dependence." The radio in the command bunker was quiet now. There were no more orders from General Kabanda, who was awaiting trial for treason. There were no more urgent communications about foreign intervention, which had been forestalled by international pressure and regional cooperation. But Traoré still monitored the communications channels, because he knew that the victory was only temporary. The foreign interests that had been exposed would adapt and find new ways to pursue their objectives. The corporations that had lost profitable arrangements would seek alternative methods of influence. The governments that had been embarrassed by the revelations would work to prevent similar exposures in the future. The decision to disobey that single order had changed everything, but it had also created new responsibilities that would last for generations. As he prepared to transfer command to the new democratically elected government, Traoré reflected on how a moment of conscience had grown into a continental movement. He had simply refused to follow an order that felt wrong, but that refusal had revealed the extent to which wrong orders had become routine across Africa. The young officers who had supported his rebellion were now senior leaders in their own right, carrying forward the principles of genuine independence and popular sovereignty. The investigation techniques developed in Burkina Faso were being used across the continent to expose corruption and foreign manipulation. The evidence standards and documentation methods had become a model for anti-corruption efforts worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, ordinary citizens across Africa had seen that change was possible when leaders had the courage to say no to systems that served foreign interests rather than their own people. On his final day as military commander, Traoré received a message from a young captain stationed near the border with Mali. The message was brief but significant. "Sir, we intercepted communications suggesting renewed foreign attempts to destabilize the region. Request permission to investigate." Traoré smiled as he drafted his response. The next generation was ready to continue the work he had started with a single act of disobedience. Permission granted. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, and remember that your oath is to the people of Burkina Faso, not to anyone who claims authority over them. The cycle would continue, because the price of independence was eternal vigilance against those who would trade it away for personal gain. No one expected that a captain's refusal to follow orders would become the foundation for a new era of African sovereignty. But that was exactly what had happened, one difficult decision at a time. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.